So in the last video, I talked a lot about how I look at games and why I approach them in a certain way, what some of my preconceptions are when looking at games, and why I like to have those preconceptions and why I apply them. But this time, I want to talk about actually applying the process and what that looks like. So to sort of demonstrate how this process works for me, I'm going to use Dark Souls as an example. And that's mostly because there's a lot to break down in Dark Souls, but also because I want to do a level design breakdown of Dark Souls, so this way there will be a nice through line. What happened was, after I had played Dark Souls, I started watching some Let's Plays, and I started seeing a pattern. I mean, I saw a lot of patterns, but one in particular really stood out, which was that people had a tendency to die, lose their souls, and then go back to try and get the souls again, and then die again, losing them permanently. And rather than getting really mad at that, which I kind of expected, people instead had this response of, well, you know what? I don't have to worry about him anymore. And that was really interesting to me because that actually kind of happened pretty consistently. So I want to get into why that happens, why people have that response. Because I also had that response, and I didn't really think about it until after I saw a bunch of other people also have it. That made me kind of realize, yeah, you know what? I had the same reaction to that, and that's really interesting, and I want to figure out what really causes that specific emotional response to something that you'd expect to be pretty frustrating or annoying or upsetting, even. And that kind of led me down a whole rabbit hole because, as it turns out, the death mechanic in Dark Souls is why the rest of it works. A lot of people talk about how Dark Souls is so difficult and it's so cool that there's a game that's finally not pandering to players, but there's a lot of games out there that are really hard that everyone hates. I could sit down in Game Maker or whatever in like probably a couple hours, make a little platformer that's insanely impossible to beat, but it's not interesting because there's no challenge that you can overcome but requires mastery. And even then there are games that require mastery but don't help you to attain that mastery. Think of how not a lot of people play something like the StarCraft multiplayer because it's just so hard to get into. It's really deep once you do, and that's really cool, but it's so difficult to actually get into that because the game doesn't do a whole lot to really help you. Yeah, their campaign helps you out a little bit, but not a ton. And when it comes to actually dealing with the mechanics of the game as they relate to a multiplayer match, it's just completely overwhelming for most players, and they just don't want to deal with it because, of course, it's totally understandable that they wouldn't want to deal with it because it's just a bunch of work for seemingly very little payoff. And the death mechanic in Dark Souls is what differentiates Dark Souls from these other kinds of experiences that are just frustrating. And it's really all about the death system and how it allows you a second chance. And I realize that that seems really obvious, but I want to talk about why allowing you a second chance makes such a huge difference. So most games work on a basic interest curve because if you just have the player get consistently more excited or more engaged in whatever emotion you're trying to engage them through, it becomes exhausting pretty quickly, and you're in this weird situation where you have to constantly outdo the last thing you did because you have to have this constant increase, and that's just not sustainable. So if you think about it like a graph, it's called an interest curve because it's actually a graph. And if you think about a bad interest curve, what you'd see is just kind of a linear progression upwards, just a trend straight up. And because that's completely not sustainable, instead you have an interest curve that sort of peaks and dips at certain locations based on certain events. And that's why games have lull periods and why there are all these like differences in kind, and you can do all kinds of cool stuff about that. And there's a lot of ways to modulate an interest curve. And one of the genres that utilizes the interest curve in what I think is probably the most interesting way is actually the horror genre. Because in a horror genre, your interest curve is built mostly around suspense. It's tension and release, and it's a cycle of tension and release, tension and release. And if you don't have that release, it's just tension and then more tension and then more tension, which gets completely exhausting and just doesn't work at all. But if you have this tension release cycle, then you end up in a situation where people can manage the horror and get really engaged by it, and they'll even continue to progress even though it feels really creepy and they're they're going to a place that they definitely don't feel very comfortable going towards, but they'll do it because they're really engaged, they're enraptured by this horror, and they're really caught up in this tension and release cycle, which is really core to how that works. Without that, you just give people heart attacks. If you could even sustain that, which you probably couldn't, people would just get bored. And Dark Souls uses a very horror-esque tension release cycle, but it uses two interest curves. One interest curve is your standard sort of action RPG style interest curve that is built around encountering enemies, overcoming obstacles, or failing to overcome obstacles. The difference is that because of the way that the death mechanic works in Dark Souls, you die and all of your souls, which are really important because they're both your currency and your experience points, so they represent progression in some sense, are now at stake every time you die. So because your souls are now at stake once you die, you enter into the second interest curve, which is actually just a tension release cycle built around your souls. So within this second interest curve, within the tension release cycle, you start that when you die, and it ends when you either regain your souls or die a second time. Because you're in a tension release cycle all built around, I gotta get those souls, that means that once that obstacle or that goal is no longer on the table, the tension is released, whether you were successful or not. And without that tension release cycle around the death mechanic, the whole game just doesn't work anymore. At best, it's a decent action RPG type game. And at worst, it's just dumb, pointless, frustrating, and annoying. Because Dark Souls can get away with so much more than it could otherwise. Think of all of the things that we just sort of excuse because it's Dark Souls. Like, Dark Souls definitely has cheap deaths sometimes. Yes, there's obviously the whole thing about how you can see them if you're really observant and you look down at things, but realistically, you can't expect players to always see everything ahead of time, even if they explore a lot. Although that is an interesting way of dealing with providing the players with some kind of reward for exploration, but that's a whole other topic. You can't really expect the players to see all of it. So sometimes they're going to have these deaths that are going to feel really cheap. But it works in Dark Souls, because in Dark Souls, they want you to die occasionally, and the reason they want you to die occasionally is, well, there's two reasons. One reason is because they want you to feel like the game is trying to get you, like the game is out to get you at all times. It's not, but again, another topic. And the second reason is that they want you to enter into this second interest curve, this tension release cycle. Because without entering into the tension release cycle, you are just on a standard interest curve, and Dark Souls can't do most of the things it's trying to do. They need you in that cycle so that you can release your tension a lot. Because releasing your tension allows them to get away with so much. Think of all the difficulty in Dark Souls, the much lauded, the famed difficulty of Dark Souls. Yes, Dark Souls is more difficult than a lot of other games, but it's not the difficulty that makes it better than these other games. It's actually sort of incidental in some ways. The difficulty is something that Dark Souls can get away with doing because of this core tension release cycle that it's constantly putting you in. Without that, it can't get away with the difficulty, because if you don't have that tension release cycle, but you do have the difficulty, then it's just frustrating and annoying, and people don't generally enjoy that. And that's sort of an example of how I would apply this process, which is very much, here's something that happened, here's something that I saw happen in other people when I tried to see the experiences that they were also having. And then I started trying to unravel it, figure out why it was working that way, because what was ultimately happening was people were losing their souls, and instead of getting really frustrated, sometimes people still get frustrated, sure, but generally there's also this sense of relief. And because of that, Dark Souls is the game that it is, and I would have never figured that out if I hadn't started asking the right questions, which is really the whole point of all of this, is that asking the right questions will inevitably lead you to better answers than if you had asked a question like, why is Dark Souls so good? Why do so many people play a game that just punishes you about all the things all the time? These are the kinds of questions that I've heard people asking about Dark Souls, and they're not good questions that will lead you to interesting analytical answers that you can actually do something with. And this is why you'll hear people say, oh, Dark Souls is good because the level design is good. And it'll sound like a good answer because they're not wrong, because level design in Dark Souls is really good. And we'll get into that later, but If you just say something like, oh, the level design is good, that doesn't give you any real information. It sort of pinpoints that one of the good things is the level design, but my question was much more specific. Why do people feel relieved when they lose their souls? And how does that factor into the game? Why might the designers have decided to make that happen? So that's a good demonstration of how asking better questions will lead to better answers, and how better answers will give you more information to work with yourself as a designer. So always be very aware of the questions that you're asking, because a lot of times they'll be sort of tacit or based on some kind of tacit assumption, and those questions will generally lead to answers that are significantly less useful for you or for the designers that you're working with.